So this morning we are going to be talking about managing peer-on-peer allegations for independent schools. We are planning on covering allegations by one pupil against another. Most of what we're seeing at the moment relates to everyone's invited. Now over 16,000 testimonials on Soma Sara's website. But many of the principles that we'll be talking about today will equally apply to other allegations of peer on peer abuse, whether of a sexual nature or otherwise. And certainly, I think the principles we'll be talking about are best practice in managing situations, pupil situations within the school. We're going to focus today on a particular matter, a particular scenario that you might be dealing with, but we will spend some time also thinking about the preventative steps that schools can and should be taking. And we'll also be picking up some frequently asked questions along the way. So the starting point is to think about our legal obligations. I have put them there. They're set out in the law, they're set out in guidance, and fundamentally, you'll all be aware that the legal obligation on schools is to act in the best interests of pupils. Where it gets complicated in this scenario is that what's in the best interest of one pupil may not be the same as what's in the best interests of the other, and the schools are having to undertake a balancing exercise between the two. So if we move on to think about a disclosure and what the school's duties are when a disclosure is made, I think the starting point with all of this is to listen effectively. And I think many of us think we know how to do that. We're used to talking to others, used to talking to children. But it is helpful, I think, to have a reminder about the particular expectations when you're listening to children making disclosures of abuse. I've set up a list of do's and don'ts. Some of these, as I say, will be self-evident. But one of the issues that we quite often see is a sort of situation where somebody is trying to do the sort of triaging and to investigate what they're dealing with at the point at which somebody comes along and speaks to them. And I'd always recommend that you allow enough time to think and process. So do listen effectively, carefully. Don't take people down a route of challenge or a route where they feel like they're not being believed. But equally, you need to find out enough to make sure you can take any immediate steps to protect those who may be involved. And as with all safeguarding matters, don't promise confidentiality and in relation to these things, because there may be circumstances that you do have to share. What I'd recommend in those instances are that you explain who you need to share and why, and that when you're dealing with disclosures, that the person understands who you're going to be talking to and when, in order to manage their own responses. I think management of expectations is absolutely key here. And this brings us on to one of the questions that we're quite often asked, which is, how do you balance the duty to believe a victim of sexual violence with that to support the alleged perpetrator? And it may be helpful just to think about what the guidance says on this. Victoria, can you help us with that?
Yes, Tabitha. It's obviously essential that victims are protected and offered appropriate support, but the same should be true of alleged perpetrators, and the school should offer support to those involved. Um, Listening and not challenging is very different from believing, and perception is very different from the truth. This is not about challenging factual accuracy. So the DSLs should really take a lead on this and be confident about what local services are available to support both the victim and alleged perpetrator.
Thank you. I think what we mean by that is there is nothing to prevent a school from engaging with somebody who has made a disclosure and listening to what they have to say and acting upon their truth and making measures and steps in response to their truth. But that doesn't mean that when you then go and speak to others, that you take that as factually accurate. You can go through a similar supportive and sensitive process with others, recognizing that they may have a different view as to what in fact happened. I don't need to quote KCSIE with you. I put this slide up merely to say that we feel your pain, that managing these sort of allegations are exceptionally complicated. And one of the things that we quite often hear is, well, the problem is that the guidance doesn't tell us exactly what we have to do. It raises as many questions as it answers. And it's really just an acknowledgement that that is the case, and that schools do need to make difficult decisions against huge pressures of time and often under real pressure from different groups of pupils and their families. So if we start with managing allegations, and I've put up a slide saying organisational preparation, because it's back to that point about you've listened to a disclosure and you need to stop and think about, okay, what are we dealing with here? There's a risk management element. We have to consider the risks that we're dealing with. We're essentially going through a triaging process to think about how serious this is and what the risks are to those involved and indeed to the school as well. We need to think about internal and external reporting obligations. I say that because quite often when we talk about reporting, we instantly rush to thinking about, oh, externally, who else do we need to tell? But I think it's very important to think about the internal reporting obligations too. We're dealing with support here. DSLs will ordinarily be leading these sort of issues. They will need support too. So consideration should be given to the wider safeguarding team, to involving the head, and indeed to thinking about the involvement of either your chair or safeguarding governor in terms of the internal mechanisms. In terms of external reporting, of course, we're going to need to think about whether to involve police or local authority, ordinarily in this scenario, children's social care. But we may also need to think about other external reporting obligations. One would be to insurers. Insurers will expect to be informed if there is a circumstance that could give rise to a claim, and there may be advantages to the school to report matters to insurers early, because they may then end up funding either professional advice, whether that's professional legal advice, or other professional advice such as PR advice, which may be appropriate. The other usual external reporting obligation that we think about in these scenarios is whether it meets the threshold for reporting to the Charity Commission for those schools which are charitable under the Serious Incident Reporting Framework. And that's something that would need to be kept under review. But there may be other external reporting obligations. Typical scenarios may be your associations. You may not have an obligation to report, but want to tell inspectorates. So you do need to think about these sort of situations and more broadly about your communication strategy, depending on how widely the allegation is known and is being shared. The priority will always be to support those involved. And I think quite often we immediately leap to support victims and alleged perpetrators. But actually, there can really be a need to support people more broadly, others who've been affected, perhaps by being drawn into circles of confidence, to staff who are dealing with extraordinarily difficult processes, and to wider families. So, of course, need to think about that. There will be some circumstances where speed is of the essence and preservation of evidence is key. I was involved in a very tricky peer-on-peer abuse allegation, which arose out of Everyone's Invited, where the school had access to Google Docs, essentially, where pupils had recorded their own testimonials, in fact, having named others. So the need to preserve evidence, but not necessarily to go behind confidences and to work with other agencies, can be extremely complicated. And could be the subject of a whole other webinar that we don't have time for this morning, but always open to offers, things that would be helpful. You'll all know about keeping appropriate records and then recording factually what's happening. One of the things that I find really helpful when dealing with these, because these sort of allegations move so quickly and change so much as more information comes to light, is keeping a chronology and sharing that with those who are managing the situation. And if it would be helpful for me to save and share just a very basic template about how we do that, I'm happy to, but I would absolutely encourage that, particularly if you don't have a safeguarding system that enables you to track not only what's happening to the pupils, but the way in which the school is managing things over time. And consistent with what I've just said about things moving very quickly is this constant need to keep things under review. So you'll make decisions based on one list of facts. More information comes to light, and it does make sense. It is necessary to go back and just do a double check of is there anything else we need to do in the light of additional information. I mentioned this in terms of who is responsible, because actually I think there is often a little bit of uncertainty about this. Decisions should be taken by the school. The DSL is seen to be the person with the leading role in safeguarding and should be leading the school's approach. And the school and the DSL in particular should be seeking advice elsewhere. So quite often people will say, oh, well, it's the local authority, it's children's social care who are responsible here. Actually, what they will say is you should seek advice from us. And of course, there are obligations to follow that advice, to consider it very carefully. The legal nature of whether you have a duty or an obligation will depend on the framework of the school and whether it's a relevant agency within the local safeguarding partners framework. But it is for the school to make decisions and for those decisions to follow the DSL's professional judgment. One of the other matters that's just worth bearing in mind here, which fits with what I was saying about internal reporting, is that there is a bit of a danger of seeing things from one perspective. And I do think it's really helpful for the DSL to consult and to have other perspectives. And that should involve both internal and, in more serious situations, external guidance. So I talked about triage. Everybody will have their own view, but when we're dealing with allegations of sexual violence and sexual harassment, I've set up a list that may be helpful. But I think that this will work quite for most allegations of peer-on-peer abuse. So you need to think about the nature of the allegation and the scenario, the context in which the allegation was raised. Is it current? Is it past? Is it relating to school operations, or is it outside of school? You need to think about whether it is an allegation which may constitute a criminal offence, and if so, how serious a criminal offence. We've talked about the particular expectations when you're dealing with allegations of sexual violence or harassment. One-off or patterns are important. Whether there's violence or coercion or abusive positions of power, that those sort of issues are important. The impact on the victim and the victim's wishes are key. And we also need, of course, to think about risks to others. I've put on there about schools' policies being engaged, because one of the questions that we quite often get are, well, if it's happened outside of school, what's our obligation? So I think it's important to think about what that obligation is. Victoria, is there anything that you can help us with on that scenario from the guidance?
Yes, well, most schools' behaviour policies will apply where pupils are taking part in any school organised or related activity. Teachers have the power to discipline pupils where they pose a threat to another pupil or member of the public, or it could adversely affect the reputation of the school. The school, of course, has a duty to protect their pupils regardless of this.
Thanks, Victoria. I think quite often it's helpful to think about a two-pronged duty when you're dealing with these things. The first being the duty to support, and the second being the expectations around sanction, whether internally within the school processes or externally involving the police. So if we move on then to managing the allegations and the various options that are available to the school and the DSL, the first is about internal management. As we've explained, that is a matter for the professional judgment of those involved. The next is to think about early help requests. We don't often see early help requests from independent schools. I think it would be extraordinarily helpful for all schools to know what the early help menu is available from their local authority, just so they have an idea about the sort of care and support that can be offered. Social services, children's social care, will of course ordinarily be looking at that as being a family support package. And in that context, they will quite often say that if you're making an early help request, you need to have the consent of families in order to make the request. In fact, we quite often see local authorities policies and procedures which suggest that parental consent is necessary for any contact with children's social care. And that is not legally accurate, particularly where you're making referrals for statutory services. So please don't feel that you can't push back and challenge local authority views in that scenario, particularly where we're talking here about situations where it may not be appropriate to share the details of allegations with other parties and their parents. You do need to think about referrals to children's social care. Of course, it's about when a child is suffering or likely to suffer from harm. So where they're at risk of harm, where they're in immediate danger, where they have been harmed, there's that duty to make a referral to children's social care. And generally, in parallel with that, the need to think about referrals to the police. The starting point in an allegation of sexual abuse is that there should be a referral to the police. And of course, what we are talking about here in terms of sexual violence is that it covers a really broad range of misconduct. And sexual assault actually has a very simple definition of intentional touching of another, where the touching is sexual, where the victim doesn't consent, and where the perpetrator doesn't reasonably believe that they do. So it could be something that ranges from being relatively minor within the context that it should be taken seriously to very serious indeed. And what we quite often see in this context is a situation where pupils will say, I don't want anyone to know, I don't want action to be taken, I don't want my parents to know, I don't want a referral to the police. And at that stage, the school's in quite a difficult situation about deciding what to do. So Victoria, does the guidance help us with this?
The guidance is helpful in respect that it says that the police will be important partners where a crime has been committed. And the starting point is if there is a report of rape, assault by penetration, or sexual assault, starting principle should be that this should be referred on to the police. Obviously, a school will have to have regard for the feelings and wishes of a victim, but and it is a matter of judgment as to when and at what point after disclosure this is made. A referral to the police will be a natural progression, and support will be offered by the local authority as well.
Thanks, Victoria. What I should say is that within that context, one of the things that is important to consider is whether the victim who is saying that they don't want matters to go to the police really understands the significance of that. And we recently did a mailing on peer-on-peer abuse, which I'll circulate with the slides after this, and gave quite a lot of information about what will happen if matters are reported to the police, to enable people to make informed consent about that process. And of course, one of the issues to bear in mind with that is to preserve somebody's right to make a formal complaint in the future, even if they don't want to do so now. So those are some of the things that are important to think about. The other a resource that we made available within that is a checklist, a template to enable the decision making, to facilitate the decision making, and also to help you document the decisions about whether or not you should report matters to the police in the absence of a victim's wishes. And as I say, that will be circulated afterwards. So if we move on now to think about investigations, one of the questions we're quite often asked is, well, can the school investigate? And what I say is, well, you will always need to do some limited form of investigation just in order to support the pupils that you're dealing with. That doesn't mean that you're necessarily investigating whether there was a criminal offence or what in fact happened, but you're going to need to do enough to make sure that you can support those involved, and you may need to do more. And we will quite often see a situation where people will say, well, we've reported matters to the police. The police are taking several weeks to think about it. We can't do anything in the meantime. And that isn't strictly true. It is possible for the school to do investigations of its own. It shouldn't do anything which would prejudice the police investigation, but it may be possible to consider whether there's been a breach of the school's own behaviour policies and to take action accordingly, or indeed to make decisions based on the balance of probabilities as opposed to the criminal burden of proof about what's happened in order to enable appropriate action to be taken. Where you can't investigate exactly what happened, then we would recommend that you act on the basis that the allegations may or may not be true, and that you plan accordingly and come back to it. The other question that we quite often see in the context of investigations is several weeks or sadly months down the line, the police may come back and say, we are not proposing to take any further action. And there's then a situation where the allegations are sort of sitting on the school's file, and it comes back to the school to decide what, if anything, should be done. And it may be appropriate for the school to undertake its own investigation at that stage. And that's a decision that should be made, whether or not further investigation is justified, with reference to all of the factors. And indeed, we recommend a discussion with the local authority in that context. You will have been thinking about the support of pupils throughout the sort of scenarios that we've been talking about. We'll know that from the latest version of the standards that there is a duty to risk assess pupil welfare. Now, the standards don't set out how you do that. In fact, they don't set out that you need to have a risk assessment of pupil welfare policy, although we recommend one and have one. And they don't set out how you should document personalised plans for pupils involved. We've seen an awful lot of different ways in which people do that, some using electronic systems and some in paper form. But certainly where you've got allegations of this nature, we would recommend that there are documented personalised plans for those who are directly affected, and that those are kept under review. But in terms of the sort of support menu that you may have, the important aspects are set out on the slide. So you need to maintain an ongoing dialogue and to recognise that the pupil may have certain trusted adults that they are willing to speak to, either internally or externally from the school. Your school may offer counselling. The pupil may prefer to access that sort of service outside of the school. But it's important, I think, that you know whether that has been offered and is being accessed. You need to make sure that the pupil has a safe place, somewhere that they are comfortable to go if they are struggling, and more broadly, to think about other adjustments to normal. You'll know that where we're dealing with allegations of sexual violence, there is an expectation that the victim will be protected from contact with the alleged perpetrator. And those sort of adjustments to timetables or normal arrangements to facilitate that are important. In this day and age, we see so much social media and other communications amongst pupils, and speculation and publication, and support with communications and the deleting of contact is very important, as is the management of expectations and signposting pupil and their parents to other services that may be helpful. And the one that we quite often see, where parents in particular are pressing for action, is about sanctions against an alleged perpetrator. They want someone held to account. And of course, it can be really difficult when you're not even able to investigate in the early stages. It can also be difficult in terms of managing your confidentiality and data protection obligations to share information, but considering what sanctions are appropriate and when, and also being very clear about what is an arrangement that is not a sanction but is pending investigation, and what is a sanction, and being clear about communications are very important in that context. I've mentioned some of the pressures that schools face from victims and alleged perpetrators and their families. That really is the difficulty. Schools walking a tightrope, a balancing pole in terms of managing these issues. Victoria, what does the guidance say about what you can tell and when you can tell alleged perpetrators and parents of those involved about the allegations?
Well, if the threshold for referral is met, then children's services and the police will be able to assist with when the timing is right. But the schools should be really mindful that they are careful not to prejudice the investigation when it is being undertaken.
Thank you. So, I mean, I think what I take from that is that if in doubt, check with children's services and or the police about what you can share and when, rather than the sort of default reaction of we want to make things better, therefore we need to tell people and take steps to rectify the position. Now, we've talked quite a lot in this context about sexual violence and sexual harassment because that's so much in the public eye following Everyone's Invited. But I just want to touch on managing other types of peer-on-peer abuse in recognising and reflecting that most of the principles that we've spoken about will apply to those other scenarios too. So last summer, we had the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and a real spate of or a spike in allegations of racial abuse and racial harassment. And actually, the similar processes will apply in terms of balancing the need to support those involved, the need to manage referrals, and the need to consider the school's own behaviour policies and sanctions where appropriate. So the framework that you have for dealing with sexual violence and sexual harassment will, I think, work well for a school when dealing with other types of peer-on-peer abuse. I wanted to touch on the Ofsted review before we just move on to talk about preventative action and contents of policies and procedures, which Victoria is going to help us with. As you'll know, it was a government response to Everyone's Invited, where Ofsted was asked to come in and explore issues of peer-on-peer abuse. It was announced earlier on this year. It was announced in April. We were told we were going to get a report by the end of May. Latest intelligence is that there is a draft in circulation, but it's not likely to be published until after the June half term, and that this is likely to hold up the latest version of KCSIE because there will be a need to consider the recommendations of Ofsted's review before finalising the version of KCSIE out for consultation. You might think that would give us a little bit more time to put that into effect, but sadly not. And at a time when safeguarding staff really need a break, I think we're going to need to expect there to be some summer holiday work in updating policies and procedures and reflecting on both the outcomes of the review and latest version of Keeping Children Safe. So let's move on and think about preventative action. Victoria, can you help us in terms of policies and procedures and changes you'd recommend in the light of all of this?
Yes, well, Tabitha, we've reviewed our own policies, and I'm sure schools are starting to look at theirs in advance of the new school year. With regard to the safeguarding policy, we recommend that perhaps you refer to the new NSPCC helpline if there's any extra support for the DSL. Perhaps you might have a designated member of staff to lead on peer-on-peer issues, whether there's mandatory training for your board and effective delegation to prioritise safeguarding in the school. We're often asked whether it's necessary to have a peer-on-peer abuse policy. It isn't compulsory to have one, so long as it is referred to appropriately in the other safeguarding policies, which include obviously the safeguarding and child protection, the behaviour and discipline and anti-bullying policies. Maybe you want to consider all staff read Part 5 if you feel that's appropriate. Looking at your RSE policy, many people will have already consulted with the school community over the content of the RSE. However, might it be appropriate now to review and further consult? Looking at the behaviour and discipline and both the anti-bullying policies, it's important to make sure that there's sufficient detail about peer-on-peer issues included in this. And of course, Tabitha has already spoken about the risk assessment of pupil welfare. The approach taken by ISI in inspection is that they're not always checking that suitable policies are in place, but they inspect how effectively schools implement these policies. So it's important to remember it's not just about policies, but it's establishing a culture at the school. Moving on to our RSE content. Obviously, RSE and relationships education for primary age pupils has become compulsory this year. There has been a slight delay due to coronavirus, and the inspectorates have said that they will be sensitive to how quickly it's been rolled out in schools. that schools should be considering things like specialist teaching. Might they consider getting uh, outside speakers into schools? Checking how it models healthy relationships and how effective is it. While the RSE guidance is quite helpful, so is the guidance on sexual violence and sexual health harassment, and it also gives some guidance on what you might like to pop in your policy. Paragraph 34, if you have a look, it can tackle issues such as healthy and respectful relationships, what respectful behaviour looks like, consent, gender roles, stereotyping and equality, body confidence and self-esteem, prejudice behaviour, sexual violence and sexual harassment is always wrong, and addressing cultures of sexual harassment.
Thanks, Victoria. And I know that you maintain our policy suite for us. You also run the compliance toolkit. Could you just explain how we've dealt with that on the compliance toolkit so that if anybody is interested in finding out more, they understand a little bit about it? And would you be happy for people to contact you direct about that with any queries?
Yeah. We always flag any new developments and how these might affect your policies. And we always recommend, we put forward recommendations for staff training and policy changes. And these are updated every month. We send out email updates and they're available to subscribers on a locked area within OnStream.
Lovely, thank you. So continuing with the theme of preventative action, the next thing that I wanted to focus on is multi-agency arrangements. So the starting point with all of this is knowledge of the relevant local arrangements. Many schools have pupils from different local authorities, boarding schools with many, and knowledge of the relevant local arrangements is important, not least that quite often there are real issues around inconsistencies of thresholds and timing and indeed availability for advice. So that as a triage, excuse me, is an important piece of the jigsaw. As is then liaison with those relevant agencies. We see a really broad difference and a really broad impact from local authorities in terms of those who are willing to talk and guide and answer questions and potentially to give advice on an anonymous basis, and those who are much more procedural and require referrals in all circumstances. But building relationships with local authorities are absolutely key. One of the things that we see from movements that we've seen in terms of Black Lives Matter and Everyone's Invited in particular, but actually that we see generally are that it's not always schools who were aware that they had an issue that are named and called out in these, and that the more public allegations are made, the more there is a likelihood of external scrutiny, and often the first port of call when others are looking into, other regulators at least, are looking into allegations or concerns, is to speak to the local authority and say, are you satisfied with the arrangements that this school has made? So within that, building a relationship with children's services is so important, even where it's tricky. And I know that, you know, that local variations are massive, but I can't emphasize that enough. And indeed, we've talked about the diversity of arrangements, but it is one of the factors that's just been picked up in the local safeguarding partners review, is the need to make those things more workable, and to recognise the cross-agency working arrangements, and make sure that they are easier to navigate. The next, in terms of arrangements, is the support that a school give to parents. And I say that because a real trend that we're seeing is not just fulfilling your contractual duty to provide information to parents, but actually much broader, an expectation of enabling them to play their part in preventative action for protecting their children and other children they come into contact with. So I would recommend that schools give some thought to what services they're already providing to help parents in safeguarding situations and in managing allegations of peer-on-peer abuse in an age-appropriate way, and maintain a dialogue with parents about how these things should be managed. And I've said ensure clarity of roles because I think quite often the guidance makes it clear that there are lots of people who could be involved, and there is often a misunderstanding about who is doing what, who's making decisions, who is looking after support or dealing with a disciplinary process or dealing with other things. And I think as part of that multi-agency, multi-party approach, actually ending with a just so we're all clear, this is who's going to do what and when, is a really helpful way of taking things forwards. And then Victoria touched on it, but it is the million-dollar question for schools. How do you ensure that you have an effective safeguarding culture? And my thought with that is, well, first of all, you need to define what you mean by an effective safeguarding culture, and I've set out my thoughts. And then you need to think about how you assess yours and how you improve it. We're all going through a process of continual improvement in the light of information that meets the school and the public domain. And I think that we all need to make sure that we prioritise reflection, that we prioritise going through a process. We've talked about how to manage allegations of peer-on-peer abuse, and that having been through one process, we take time to think, okay, well, what would we have done different? What could we have done to have prevented this? Is this part of a trend? Is this something that we need to do more or different to manage? Did people come forward and disclose? And if not, why didn't they? And discussion forums and surveys and codes and engagement are really important in creating a culture and indeed changing cultures where that's necessary. It is also, I think, what Victoria was saying earlier on, one of the questions that inspectorates will ask when they come in, whether it's Ofsted coming in or ISI on inspection, the Charity Commission coming in. One of the questions that people will ask is, how can you be satisfied that you have an effective safeguarding culture? And thinking about how you assess it and what your KPIs are around that, I think are really important. And it will then inform what you do next in terms of that preventative action piece that we've been talking about just now. I've highlighted some resources that you will be aware of in terms of this. Of course, KCSIE was updated in January, but those were relatively minor changes. We've talked about it being updated again. We are doing some linked training over the next couple of weeks. So we've got some more detailed training on how you investigate not just these allegations, but how you investigate allegations generally, staff and parent pupil next week. And we've got some safeguarding governance training on the, I'll confirm it, but it's on the 7th or 8th of June that may be of interest. But that is the end of the presentation this morning and where we are. I'm very happy to answer any questions that you may have. I'm going to stop screen sharing so that I can see you.
Right, we've had a few questions, so I'll read those out to you because you won't have had a chance to have a look at them yet. So just taking it from the top, we've had a couple of people ask about the template chronology list that you mentioned earlier in the presentation. Is that something that we can share in the follow-up? Yeah, okay, brilliant. Okie dokie. So that's the first couple of questions. So moving on, how should a school treat a case of bullying where the bully is a child with special needs? Should that child be treated differently? Where can we get information on this? And also, how do we communicate that this child may be being treated differently because of the special needs, which we can't discuss with other children, but it might be the reason behind the bullying?
This is probably longer than we can deal with this morning in terms of those particular issues, but happy to touch base about it. Essentially, we do all have a duty to think about whether your child with special needs is disabled and whether you need to make reasonable adjustments to usual processes in that context. And in terms of wider communications, again, that will involve careful discussions with the family about the extent to which those needs can and should be shared. Victoria, is there anything you'd like to add about that?
Well, with children with special educational needs, obviously KCSIE flags that those children are more susceptible to bullying. So it could be that the bully is in fact a victim of bullying themselves. So there are special considerations in that sense.
Great, thank you. Okay, moving on to the next question then. So, am I right in thinking that police could still investigate and charges made even if the victim does not want to progress the investigation?
You are right in thinking that. I think that's Andrew who has asked that question. So essentially what would happen is that if allegations are referred to the police will usually have a short discussion while they go through their own triaging process and will then undertake an achieving best evidence interview. In situations of sexual violence, that's normally a video interview. And they will normally gather the victim's evidence and any evidence to support the victim's account before such time as they will speak to the alleged perpetrator. Now, at the point at which the achieving best evidence interview has been made, the matter is capable of being pursued against the alleged perpetrator. And the police and CPS have a duty to consider whether it's in the public interest to prosecute. The fact is it would be extremely unusual for them to prosecute in those circumstances, or indeed to investigate, which I think is what your question was. But it is within their powers to do so. And it's one of the things that you'll want to be explaining to victims when you're having a discussion about whether it should go to the police.
Great, thanks, Tabs. Okie dokie. So just a couple more. So we've just had a question about the compliance toolkit. So is it okay if we direct people to contact you, Victoria, if they want some more information on that? Okay, we'll share Victoria's contact details in the follow-up email. So if you do want to get in touch and find out more about that, then we will send that to you. And then I think we just have one more.
I've seen that this is the one from Ed, and it's a particular case which I'll touch base about in more detail. But the scenario is one that I suspect will be quite common, and it's a situation where there are allegations of serious peer-on-peer sexual violence, and the police go through a process and decide there's insufficient evidence to prosecute. And at the time that the police decision is made, both the victim has then shared quite a lot of information within the school community, and there's chunter through social media maintaining their position that they were the subject of a sexual assault, and it's how the school should balance its duties to both of them. And this is one of those, I think, where understanding whether the school should undertake its own investigation is quite important, but where the school needs to balance a tightrope in terms of explaining that the allegations may or may not be true, and the mere fact that the police are deciding to take no further action doesn't mean that it didn't happen, and that in circumstances where a victim is saying it did and an alleged perpetrator is saying it didn't, means that without an investigation, the school isn't able to form a view about whether or not it happened. You can, of course, manage or seek to manage the discussions about it in school through the school's policies and procedures about what it's appropriate to comment on in that scenario. I hope that's helpful as a general point, and happy to talk about the specifics.
Tabitha or Victoria, anything you'd like to add before we deck out?
No, just thank you very much for joining us this morning. I hope it's helpful. And if you do have any specific questions, do please contact either myself or Victoria. Thank you.